Hello, welcome back to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen. I am an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I prepare these videos on a weekly basis for twofold purpose. First off is to move my brain out of percolation mode as I've been thinking about the sermon and the text throughout the course of the last week into sermonation mode, which is what I call it when I'm actually writing and preparing the sermon that I will preach for my congregation on this coming Sunday. That's the first reason that I do this. It's just a helpful thing that I do for my own purposes. And secondly, and perhaps the more important reason, is for you, the viewer, who have stumbled across this video for whatever reason has brought you here today, to gain a little bit of further insight or an additional opinions, insights, thoughts, whatever, on the gospel text for the week, the scripture lesson that is assigned. This Sunday, which happens to be March 8th, 2015, the third Sunday in Lent, our gospel lesson is John 2, 13 through 22. We skip now for a couple of weeks out of the Gospel of Mark, which is the main focal point during this particular church year within the lectionary, and we hear now from the Gospel of John. Now, if you've heard me in these videos before talk about John, you know John is my favorite of the four Gospels. I like it just because it's different. John is unique. He was a unique guy. I don't know. Weird. Tangent. Sorry. But I do enjoy John. It's always enjoyable for me when the lectionary takes us into this particular gospel. This story is one that is found in all four gospels. Always interesting when we hit particular stories like that. Sometimes the unique stories are good because we get a unique perspective into the life and ministry and action of Jesus, but also when we find one that's present in all four Gospels, that's interesting as well. This one is no different. Today's story is known commonly as the cleansing of the temple, the time when Jesus came into the temple and found a lot of people selling animals for sacrifice and money changers that were offering the option for having the correct coinage for the temple taxes and things of that nature. But that's just kind of the super small background, so let's look into the scripture itself, shall we? The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." His disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "The temple has been under construction 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days." But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Now, after he had been raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus had spoken. That is the gospel lesson for this week. Now, some thoughts. John, as I said a moment ago, is unique and different from the other three Gospels. They are all three very closely connected. And as I've said before, Mark is thought to be one of the sources that was used in Matthew and Luke both as they were writing their Gospels. And so that's where a lot of the similarities come from, is that. But John is different. John was written later. In a very different circumstance. Now, in the three synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the cleansing of the temple happens towards the end, actually right before the arrest and crucifixion of Jesus. So it happens within the last week of his life. Here, we see this in chapter 2. So we are very, very early on in the gospel. The only thing that's happened prior to this, in chapter 1, we have the prologue of John, verses 1 through 17, which is kind of the introduction to the gospel itself, talking about what's going on. That happens to include some of my favorite portions of scripture. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. I may come back to that. I may not. We'll see where the brain goes. But then we transfer into some of the beginning of the action of the narrative within John, and we see that the first thing that Jesus ends up doing is the wedding at Cana. This is where he performed his first miracle, according to John, or the first sign is what they call them here in John. And at the wedding in Cana, they ran out of wine, and for whatever reason, Jesus was, well, he was a guest there along with his disciples, but so he's there, and Mary, his mom, is there, and she, for whatever reason, is taking a little bit of ownership of this issue of no wine, and she's like, hey, Jesus, they don't have any wine. And he's like, so? What's that got to do with me? And she says, well, do something about it. You're God, for all intents and purposes, so do something. And Jesus then tells the servants, hey, there's some jars over there. It's got water in it. It's just kind of there. Take some of that out and give it to the head guy. And they do, and the water has become wine, and it's the greatest wine ever. And it's like, that's his first sign. And then directly following that, he heads off to Jerusalem for the first time to go to the festival of Passover. Now, as a Jewish guy who lived in the vicinity, and I'll use that word very lightly, of Jerusalem, he went to the major festivals. And there were a few festivals every year. Don't quote me on how many. I know it's at least 3, but it might be more than that. But we hear that he goes. It's just his common thing. Even though Jesus' main bulk of his ministry happened around the region of Galilee, which is quite a ways north of Jerusalem, in kind of a completely different region, he would travel to Jerusalem for these major festivals. Now, it's because of John's gospel that we hear that Jesus had a 3-year ministry. This is, again, another little difference from the synoptic gospels, that we hear he only goes to Jerusalem for Passover once in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. So they kind of give the impression that perhaps his time of ministry was only a single year. But in John, we hear 3 different times that he goes to Jerusalem for Passover. The final one, the third one, being when he was arrested and crucified. Wow, tangent. But that brings us back around to this fact that here in John's gospel, the cleansing of the temple, found in all 4 gospels, happens very, very, very early within John's gospel, and really serves to set up the tension that exists between Jesus and the religious establishment. That's a very common theme. Oftentimes here in John, we just hear them called the Jews. The Greek for it is the Judei, and we don't know exactly who they are. Scholars don't think that refers to the entire Jewish culture, but rather a distinct group of people who were in opposition to Jesus, and likely we think that's a lot of the religious elite, the Pharisees, Sadducees, for example, because they, as we hear throughout the course of all of the Gospels, they're constantly coming into contact and kind of bickering with Jesus. So we think that's who this is referring to, but we don't exactly know. But anyway, so this story serves to really establish that from the get-go, that Jesus was here to create something new. We've heard the phrase, the kingdom of heaven has come near, with Jesus coming on the scene. And this is, what he's doing. This is some of his work while on earth, is to create something new. It's also interesting, speaking of that, another little difference that happens here compared to the other 3 Gospels, it has to do with the wording. When Jesus walks into the temple and he gets angry, zeal for your house will consume me, or jealousy for your house will consume me. What he kind of yells at the people is a little bit different. In the other 3 Gospels, he says, don't turn my Father's house into a den of thieves or a den of robbers. Here it's, don't turn my Father's house into a marketplace. But now what's interesting about the temple culture or the temple activity is that this marketplace, the stuff that was going on, was actually needed. See, when people would come to the temple, they did so for the purpose of sacrifice. Sacrifice for sins, because as we hear in the book of Hebrews, no, Romans, Paul, somewhere. Blanking totally. Google this and you'll find it. My pastor brain is failing at the moment. The wages of sin is death. I think that's Romans, but it could be Hebrews, and I apologize. I can't remember. But the wages of sin is death. And this was true even in the case of the Old Testament prior to Jesus, that when the people would sin, and we all know that we did, and they knew that they did, they would go to the temple and they would make an animal sacrifice to atone for that sin. So we see the same sort of situation, and then Jesus becomes the ultimate atoning sacrifice. That's a whole different story. I won't go on that tangent, but that's kind of what's going on. So, and a lot of the people, especially at these festival times, would be traveling large distances, and they couldn't necessarily bring their own cow with them, or bring a sheep, or bring a dove, or whatever, as they traveled. And so these people who were selling the animals for sacrifice were actually doing, at least initially, were doing a service for these people as they came to do that. Now, the whole money changer situation, also true. There was a temple tax. There just kind of was. And there were temple offerings. Well, at the temple here in Jerusalem, they needed a specific kind of money. And remember that in the Roman Empire, which was large and vast, and covered a lot of ground, a lot of regions, a lot of different areas, there was different kinds of money. There just was. Similar to how we have money here in the United States that's different from Canadian money, and it's different from the money in Mexico, and it's different from the euros over in Europe, and it's different from stuff in Asia. It's just, cultures have their own currency. Same deal here. So they were there to exchange money to allow the people to make the payments they needed to make while they were there in Jerusalem. The bad stuff about all this, or what we think about, particularly in terms of the Synoptic Gospels, is that they are taking advantage of the people, charging astronomical rates, far overcharging both the people selling the animals as well as the money changers. And that's where the whole den of robbers thing comes from in the statement of Jesus in those other Gospels. This is something different. Jesus says here in John's Gospel, don't turn my Father's house into a marketplace. And yet, as I said, what's going on is necessary. Perhaps it's been twisted by human greed, whatever. Yeah, we'll acknowledge that. But it's needed to follow the rules, to follow the good order, whatever you want to call it, in order to do what they've been instructed to do. They need this culture. So again, coming back to what I had said before, that Jesus is making something new, that's also what's going on here. Don't turn my Father's house into a marketplace. That's not what we get. This isn't going to cut it anymore. This doesn't. This whole establishment is turning into something different. And why? Well, because in John's Gospel, Jesus tells us over and over again, I am. AKA, I am God. Because I am is the name that God gave to Moses to give to the people for God. I am. Jesus is God. Period. End of story. And the signs that we constantly hear of, whether it's the wedding in Cana, turning water into wine, this, when he says, hey, tear down the temple and I'll build it in 3 days, and talking about himself, aka his body, these signs throughout the course of John's Gospel are there so that the reader or the people who hear it might believe. We see a little glimpse of that right here. The disciples remember this, and after Jesus raises from the dead, they remember he said it and they believed it. And we even hear towards the end of John's Gospel, all these things have been written down so that you may hear them and believe. That's what Jesus was doing. And believing what? Well, believing he's God. And if he is God, well, then God is chosen to put on flesh and will no longer be contained in the temple, will no longer be contained in the Holy of Holies behind this little curtain where no one can actually go except for the high priest one day a year when he goes in to make this one final sacrifice. God's not going to be contained. God chooses to be among us in the form of Jesus. Boom, mind blown. And that's what's going on here. That's what he's talking about with cleaning out the temple. It's not just, hey, you guys are jerks and you're taking advantage of people. It's this is no longer needed because God has chosen to be among us. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us. Told you I'd probably go back to the prologue there, but anyway, okay, I was getting off on a little tangent, getting a little excited. As you know, that does happen to me from time to time. The last point that I think I want to make today, and yes, I've been kind of all over the map, and somehow I've already been talking for 15 minutes. Jesus gets angry. I was reading something earlier this week that talked about angry Jesus, and that can be mind blowing. Sometimes we tend to think of Jesus as very calm and very mild mannered, and he is compared to the lamb who patiently waits for slaughter and makes no sound, and he's meek and mild and he loves everybody, and yes he does, but Jesus gets mad. Jesus gets that righteous anger, and what's he do with it? Well, he drives something out. Now, this is there's an ambiguity in the original language here for who or what Jesus is driving out with that whip of cords that he makes right at the beginning of the gospel. Is he driving out all the people, all the merchants, all the money changers? In the other gospels, it's a little more clear that that's what he's doing, that he drives not only the animals, but also the people who are selling them out of the temple courts. Here, it's ambiguous, and we don't know. And it really kind of seems like, particularly in the translation that I read, which is the NRSV, that he's driving out the animals. He's crabbing out the people and kind of ripping into them, but he's only driving out the animals. In the midst of all this, Jesus makes a very, very fiery, passionate correction, but he is going on there. So anyway, that's kind of where things are going. If you have any questions or comments that you want to share, I'm ending a little abruptly, I realize that, but I've been going on long enough and I need to cut this off. So that's kind of what's happening with this. If you have any questions or comments, by all means, please share those down in the comment section. I always enjoy hearing from you, and we can continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we'll catch you later.